mouth is when I'm ocean waves.
Today on Racing Legends podcast, I have Jon Stettin from Past the Wire. He's a horse racing expert, great handicapper, a pick six expert. John, great to see you. Thanks for joining me.
Always a pleasure talking horses with you, Julian.
Oh, thanks, John. Well, we just got done our Derby season, and I call that kind of our silly season, the end of the Derby season, because we spend months and months and months and months talking about this race, and then, it's so hard to predict what's going to happen months in advance, but it's fun. It brings new fans to the game, and it is our most important week of the year. But it's behind us. But it was quite an eventful week. I just want to get some of your thoughts on Derby week. First of all, unfortunately, we had all these horse deaths on the track Derby week. And I wanted to get a sense from you whether you thought it was just kind of, bad luck of the draw that happened this week, or is there something more sinister going on? What were your thoughts about all the deaths that happened this week?
Obviously, it was saddening, and obviously, it was unfortunate. It's the worst part of our game. I did find it unusual. I'm not one to speak blindly, so I don't really know what, if anything, was going on. The breakdowns on the racetrack are something that we see. Sometimes they do come in spurts. I think that's just a cyclical thing, maybe. What was really odd were the two, sudden deaths of Safi Joseph horses that just, passed during a race from, as of now, unknown causes. Necropsies will be performed on both of those horses, probably have been already. Kentucky doesn't release the full findings of those, as I understand it, only in part, or maybe only whether or not a cause was determined. I'm not sure how they handle that, or if they'll handle that any differently in this case, Julian. But that was troubling, because in all my years in being in racing, and I remember the year that Go for Wand broke down in the Breeders' Cup Distaff tragically in the stretch. Earlier on the card, a lot of people don't remember this, but there was a horse running in the sprint called Mr. Nickerson, that suffered a sudden death during the running of the Breeders' Cup Sprint and just collapsed and died on the racetrack. It's happened. We all know that Medina Spirit died during a workout, following him winning the Kentucky Derby, ultimately subsequently being disqualified. But, it's something that happens, but never two back-to-back in races like that from the same barn, that I can recall ever occurring. So that was certainly an oddity. But it's a very, very funny situation to deal with from a racing jurisdictional standpoint, in my opinion, because as of our conversation today, what do we know? Safi Joseph is guilty of having two horses die during a race. Was not caught with anything that we know of, didn't use anything that we know of, and banning him, suspending him, takes away any right that he may or may not have to any type of due process or hearing or anything like that. Is that fair? I don't know the answer to that question, but I do know that due process is something that we all should respect. I also think, and here's where it becomes hard for me to differentiate, that, racing and the acceptance of entries from a trainer are discretionary. And it's a privilege to be able to race horses. It's not your right to be able to go and race horses. We have no right to do that. So a racetrack, in an abundance of caution, can say, hey, basically, we don't know what happened. And until we do, you're not welcome here. And I get that. Violates due process, which we believe in. So to me, it's a much more complicated issue than it is to a lot of other people, because people are usually on that issue on one side or the other. A, he's entitled to due process, and you can't just ban him until you know what he did. And B, obviously he's doing something, or this never would have happened. Throw him off the grounds. And I can't get to either one of those places fairly in my own mind. You know what I mean? So it's a very tough situation for me. I'm hoping that they figure out what happened so that it can be dealt with accordingly and appropriately. And if there is anything nefarious, then I'm for zero tolerance and as harsh as can possibly be. But I don't know what happened. I know it's very, very odd. The breakdown, some people are saying it's related to the track being souped up for Derby week. Everybody likes fast times. The track seemed fast, but I don't know if that caused it. Are we pushing horses too hard to make these big races on the big days? That's another issue. I mean, even the races on the undercard, Julian, the maiden races and the other stakes and whatnot, people want to win on Derby weekend. If you got a horse running in the Oaks on Oaks Day and even one of the maiden races or Derby Day, everybody wants to win. It's like, people want to break their horses' maidens up at Saratoga. It's the same kind of vibe and atmosphere. So are we pushing them too much, too soon, too early for that? I don't know. A lot of these questions need to be answered and need to be addressed. I do think that there are serious issues with the vets list. I think that was exposed this week, especially with the situation surrounding Forte being on the vets list until Friday, coming off it Friday. So if the Derby was run on Friday on Oaks Day, he wasn't eligible to run. He was eligible to run Saturday. He was a vet scratch in the morning, put him back on the vets list for another 14 days. So theoretically, he's on a vets list for 28 days straight. We don't really know exactly what for, especially in the first case. And now the way the KHRC handles their vet list, if you go back and try and look, he doesn't even appear on it because they purge it when they update it. So you can't go back and look. I know he was on it because I've got screenshots of it, but if I didn't have screenshots of it, there's no way to show that. You know what I mean? So I think that's a lack of transparency when we call for more transparency. So I think there are some problems and issues with that. I mean, anybody who understands the rules, I mean, they were talking about, well, now we're going to point for the Preakness. He couldn't run into Preakness. I mean, I knew that Saturday morning. I said, he's not running into Preakness. He's a vet scratch today. It's 14 days. He's got to work. He's got to have blood drawn. And 14 days from now, that's Preakness Day. Can't happen. You know what I mean? So I don't think I know the rules better than people that were saying they were pointing for the Preakness. So it's a mystery to me. I just don't understand the hypocrisy, lack of transparency, and just lack of professionalism to some degree in the way the whole vet list thing in Kentucky is and was handled in this particular case and others as well.
Yeah. Well, let's get back to Safi Joseph for a while. Safi Joseph is an incredibly charismatic figure. He's a white guy with a thick, what I would usually characterize as a Jamaican accent. So when he talks, he's an interesting guy. He's a South Florida native like yourself. My guess.
No. He's from Barbados.
From Barbados, but he lives in South Florida now.
South Florida, yes.
Yes, I'm sure you probably know him.
I've had him on the show. I've interviewed him on the show.
Yeah.
Very, like you said, very charismatic, very straightforward. Openly addressed when he was on my show the allegations and innuendos surrounding people calling him a cheater and saying, "Hey, if anybody can prove anything, if anybody's getting evidence, bring it on. I don't do anything that I have to hide." That was his attitude on my show.
Yeah. And it's
didn't dodge any questions, didn't evade anything like that. Knows those rumors are out there and was willing to talk about them and, denied him and said, anybody, can prove otherwise, speak now. So far, nobody has.
It can be so hard to prove a negative for a guy like Safi. So, but we'll wait and see. So John, when all these things happen on Derby week and all these things happen to horse racing generally, do you worry about the survival of our sport? You made a living in horse racing both as a wagerer and also through your terrific racing channel, your podcast, and other things. Do these things bother you, or racing always survives? We'll move on. What's your attitude?
No, they bother me quite a bit. I do worry about the future and survival of the sport for these issues and many others. I think racing has always failed to recognize and acknowledge who its core customers are. And I think that's a poor business model. And I think a lot of racetracks and a lot of racing is on life support through casinos and other funding. That if that was taken away, they would be in trouble. I think takeout is far too high. I think that the perception is not handled properly. I think that the promotion of the sport is not handled properly. I think the issues with the computer-assisted wagering players are not looked at objectively by the people that call for banning them. I am not a fan of any of the edges and any of the advantages that they have, but I'm no mathematician, but I know that they make up 30, 35%, maybe 40% of the handle at some racetracks and pretty much in racing across the board. And we're struggling already. Subtract that out. Where are we? Can the sport survive without them? I don't know the answer to that, so, yeah, it's easy to say, get rid of them, get them out. You know what I mean? I don't know that's good come Monday morning when there's no money to pay purses or anything else. So racing to me has a very poor business model, a very questionable prognosis going forward. I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know that we have the right leaders and team in place to make the right moves and the right calls. And it seems that not to use a cliche, but if we take, one step forward, we'll take 2 steps back shortly thereafter.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's good consideration, John. So I know several years ago when I talked to you, you put a good percentage of your handle on big weeks like Derby Week, Breeders' Cup Week, other, similar types of race and monument days. Do you still do that? And do you still think it's a good idea?
I do still do that. And I do still think it's a good idea. I don't think it's as flawless an idea as I did at one point, and that really changed after the indictment of Jason Service. And I read the actual whole indictment. You know what I mean? I don't just read the headlines or the articles. I actually read the indictment, and the indictment said that maximum security was given performance enhancing drugs prior to the Kentucky Derby and in the Kentucky Derby. And that kind of blew my theory out of the water, because I always thought, at least on those days, I know we got a level playing field and nobody is doing anything that they shouldn't be. So if we believe that indictment, and he did ultimately plead guilty to it, it kind of takes that theory right out of the game. You know what I mean? So, I still think that it's a more level playing field, and I still think that there's a better shot there, for a multitude of reasons than there is on a, Thursday afternoon at Parks, let's say. But do I think it's a flawless approach at this point? No, I don't. I think that things go on the big stage, just probably not as much or as blatant as on the small stage.
Yeah. Well, what was your frame of mind going into the Derby? Forte, the favorite, the defending champion, the Breeders' Cup champion, was a very late scratch. Other prominent horses were scratched as well. We're down to 18 horse field, which doesn't even seem that big anymore. What was your frame of mind coming into the race as a player?
Well, I thought I thought they made the call that they had to make in scratching the horse for sure. I thought there was a large number of scratches. I think that if racing wasn't in a cautious mode right now and a perception mode right now, and if they weren't concerned about organizations like PETA and national television picking up on stories, and this same things that happened maybe 15 or 20 years ago, these horses probably would have raced. So that was one thought that I had. As far as my wagering approach, it didn't really affect that at all. I was going to wager against Forte, whether he was in the race or not. Obviously not, you're not really wagering against him, but I was going to bet against him. So it didn't really affect it that way. Obviously it affected the odds and the payoff and some, structuring decisions that I may have made, but, it was Derby and we get caught up in the hype and caught up in the sport and the competitiveness of it. But it was not, our best year for sure. With everything that transpired.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about the actual race. So, if going into the race, people were talking the pace was going to be moderate. There was no front runners in the race, which I thought was a really funny statement because in a 1.25 mile race, the pace is going to be made by the jockeys. I mean, the horses can go as fast. A horse of that quality can go 45 if you ask them to. Well, they do it in the mornings all the time. So, if the jockeys, if they want to, they can go fast. And the pace was blistering. They went 45 seconds. They went 3 across, and it was really befuddling to me. But it did happen. The horse Two Fills, it got some late action after Forte was scratched. Got a terrific ride by Jareth Leatherberry. Did I pronounce that right? Not a prominent rider, but a tremendous ride. Cut the rail home, led home. Mage, who was from your neck of the woods, runner up in the Florida Derby, a horse that had just got beat by Forte. Broke badly again, but saved ground. Had some traffic trouble. Javier took him wide, circled the field, and won very impressively. I was very impressed by the way he won run. Really because he had very little experience. People were saying that the pace favored him, but we don't even know if he's a closer. I mean, he showed speed in his early races. He just hasn't been able to get out of the gate quickly enough to take advantage of it. But it looks like to me, we have a horse with tremendous ability who won the race.
I would have to agree, and I would have to say that his trainer Gustavo Delgado and his son assistant Gustavo Delgado Jr. and Ramiro Restrepo, the primary owner. I mean, they made every right call with that horse. And they did a phenomenal job getting him ready to run like that off only 3 races. I think they really deserve, a shout out for a phenomenal job. They really do. I mean, that was not an easy ask of that horse. And he answered every question. And, the funny thing is, they knew what they had. They believed in their horse. They won a maiden on the Pegasus card. I was there that day. I was there when he ran in the Fountain of Youth. He didn't run well at all. They didn't lose faith. They went from the maiden to the Fountain of Youth. They ran back in the Florida Derby because they knew their horse was doing well. He gave Forte all that he could handle at that point, and Forte was supposed to beat him that day. So all these people that say, well, with Mage winning, had Forte run, he'd have won for sure. I think that's a very, very silly, poor take. Okay. Different day, different race. Mage was further along. I mean, I don't know how you get to that conclusion if you really understand racing at all. But he's definitely a very talented horse who's been handled very well by people who obviously knew he was a lot better than some other people knew. They never backed off on him. You know what I mean? They never, they didn't commit to the Derby. They took their time to make their decision. But when they saw he was going in the right way, they said, let's go. I'm friends with Ramiro. We discussed it before the race. I told him, listen, I'm not going to fault you for running in the Derby, but if you're running just to run, I wouldn't do it. I would give my horse a confidence builder if I was fortunate enough to run a horse like that, and I would go into the Preakness and get everybody. He's like, no, we're only going to run if we think we can win. And they did. So, hats off to him. It was a gutsy call. It was the right call. And the horse answered the bell. He really did. He really did. I mean, he telegraphed it in the Florida Derby that he had a lot of ability. He made that big early, wide move. And again, Forte was a lot more seasoned than him, a lot more experienced, and him was supposed to beat him that day, and he gave him all he could handle. So, he's a really, really nice colt. It looked like he ran really hard on Derby Day. Coming back in 2 weeks into Preakness, if that's what they elect to do, is going to be another big ask for him. You know what I mean? To ask him to come back quick and, do that again is a big ask. But based on every call that this team has made with this horse so far, I gotta think they'll make the right call. And if they run, it's because he's up to it, and he'll probably give a good account of himself again.
Yeah. Well, John, you're a trip handicapper. You spend a lot of time. You sell trip notes that are very effective. One source of frustration I have, whenever a horse wins, and like, for example, last year, Rich Strike won in a blistering pace. And again, this year, Mage benefited from a pace. But people seem to forget every other factor besides the pace. In Rich Strike's case, I think he was like 5th or 6th in distance travel. He had trouble. Mage is different than Rich Strike in that Rich Strike is a one paced horse. He is one gear, and that's it. He is more pace dependent. Mage was able to make different moves within the race to get position. You don't see horses do that in long races like that. What I was impressed at, it wasn't like he made a sustained move. He did make a sustained move, but early in the race, he was left at the gate. He was able to dart to the rail. He got trouble into the far turn. Javier had to wait. When he asked him, he moved quickly. It was so much more than pace handicapping. Do you ever think, as a trip handicapper, what do you think about that? Do you think people go too far sometimes when they just take the pace out of context and don't consider any other fact? Like you mentioned earlier, it was only his 4th race. For him to accomplish this without the kind of seasoning that Forte had and even Two Fields had, it's quite an accomplishment.
100%. And I think it's a big mistake just to factor the pace and not the trip for sure. And I'm glad that a lot of people do that, because it helps create edges for the rest of us going forward. So, but yeah, no, I think that's a big mistake. He did not have an ideal trip. I only watched the replay once so far. I'll watch it several more times, but I only watched it once. And the only 2 horses that trips I really thought affected how they ran was Mage, and Angel of Empire, believe it or not. I didn't like Angel of Empire going in at all. Wasn't on any of my tickets, didn't like him, didn't think he was going to win. I was glad they made him the favorite. But the way he ran, I think I was wrong about him. I think he could have won. And I'm not really a jockey criticizer. And when I am, I do it in a professional and respectful way. And I always put in the factor that I'm not riding a horse, so I'm not feeling, seeing, and knowing what the rider may know, see, and feel. But I thought that Pratt did not give Angel of Empire his best shot to win. I thought he was further back than he had ever been before. And he had been pretty far back in some other races. Now, they were going fast, so we can make some concessions for that, okay? Maybe Pratt realized or knew the pace was fast, or the pace just being fast prompted him to be further back than he normally would be. But he was very, very far back, made a very big, wide, long, sustained run that was almost impossible to keep up and win off. You know what I mean? So when he made that big run and got into contention, and for a minute looked like he may run everybody down, I said, how is he possibly going to sustain that? You know what I mean? And I started looking at, I saw he caught my eye as a horse that might win. And then I started looking for somebody else. I'm like, there's no way he's going to be able to sustain that. Somebody else has got to be moving better than him. And I started scanning the field, looking to see who it was. And it was Mage and Two Phils were really the ones that were running at the end, honestly. Or at least running better than anybody else, in my opinion. But I thought that Pratt maybe could have been closer, maybe could have saved some ground, maybe could have moved a little later or a little sooner, and not have to make that one big, giant, monstrous, run that was almost impossible to sustain. So had I bet Angel of Empire, I'd have been very disappointed in the ride and thought, the jock cost me, my best shot to win. And Mage, I thought, like, I saw what you saw, really, that, things didn't go exactly his way. He was able to overcome it. The other horse wasn't, but it's a testament really to Mage and Javier too, who rode, you know, one of his best races while not really in his prime. He's
Yeah.
probably seen his better days. He's getting towards the twilight stage of his career, but he certainly rose to the occasion, probably knowing, hey, I may not have many, if any, more chances to win this race. And I loved in one of the interviews that I saw, where he said he knew he was going to win Turner for home. You know what I mean? He was basically in, don't make no mistakes, don't mess up, you got this. You know what I mean? And I like to see that kind of confidence from a rider, especially in a race like that early on in the race. You know what I mean? Especially an experienced guy like Javier, who's been in big moments before. I think he's won more Travers than anybody else. So he's been in big, right? He's been in big races. You know what I mean? He's won Breeders' Cup Classics and stuff like that. So he's been on the big stage and knows. And for him to say, turning for home, he knew he was going to win the race if he didn't mess up, is kind of cool, in my opinion. You know what I mean?
Hopkins one of these guys where he doesn't have a classic riding style. So when he wins, it's not because he saved ground or he got the pace right, or traditional reasons a horse wins. Javier seems to get extra run out of horses in his own way. And sometimes you kind of just, when his horses win, you just kind of scratch your head and they win in his own way. He's always been that kind of rider that seems to get a little extra out of horses. Maybe he feels them in his hands. I'm not sure what he does. I'm very happy for him. He seems like a real class act. I know the other riders like him. Well, John, and I think you actually know Javier. I think you've interviewed him on your show.
Yes.
Yeah. But going forward, are there any strangers that did not enter the Derby that we should be looking at? We should be looking for in the Preakness in the Belmont?
Definitely. Baffert is sending National Treasure to the Preakness. National Treasure has been a horse that really first caught my eye at the Breeders' Cup last year. Okay. Baffert had Cave Rock, who was the favorite. Forte wound up winning the race. But I could tell you this, Forte is a brilliant looking specimen of a racehorse. I would say National Treasure is the horse at the Breeders' Cup last year that if we were strictly going on looks, we were going out every morning and just watching horses train. We had no past performances. We didn't know who they were. We were just watching, okay, these are the horses that are going to run into juvenile. Okay. 9 out of 10 trained eyes would have picked National Treasure. He looked and trained that good. Okay. He didn't run all that good. He ran okay. And I said, well, to me, that was a little bit disappointing because he certainly didn't run the way he looked and trained. And when he came back as a 3-year-old, I thought this horse may have a big race in him, because he looked that good and he hasn't shown that yet. Okay. Now, he's coming into the Preakness fresh as a new shooter for a guy who is definitely, I think, if history has shown us anything, Baffert is not going there for the crab cakes. Okay. And if he stays home in California and sends Jimmy Barnes, he ain't sending Jimmy Barnes there for the crab cakes. So that big race that I thought National Treasure may have in him may show up at Pimlico. So that's one. Another horse, I think his name is Strategic Mission, the horse that won the Lexington for Brad Cox. When he won the Lexington, Brad Cox said, this may very well wind up being my best 3-year-old, not running in the Derby. I thought that was an odd statement to make. Now, I guess when you have a shed row like Brad Cox has, you can make statements like that because you've got a multi-million-dollar, if not, I mean, who knows what his shed row is worth, right? But here's a guy that's got 4 horses in the Kentucky Derby, one of who is going to be a favorite or a co-favorite in Angel of Empire, and a horse that's not even running that wins the Lexington, which is, let's face it, a tier 2 prep, if that, okay? Says this might be my best 3-year-old. I thought that was a slight to his other horses, or in the alternative, a tell or a tip of the hand of how good Strategic Mission might be. So he's going to be a new shooter in the Preakness, and I think based off that alone is one that warrants a good long hard look, at least from me.
Yeah. Historically, horses that skipped the Derby did not do well in the Preakness. But I really haven't paid attention the last 15 years whether that's still the case. Is that changed at all over the last 15
No,
years?
it's historically correct. But you see me, I don't get that much into those stats. I like to be aware of them and I like to look at them. Like I knew going in that they ran X amount of UAE derbies and they never had a horse hit the board. Okay. I didn't like Dermisotokake at all, but not because of that. Okay. But I was aware of that. I think that stats, you're an NFL fan. Okay. You're going to be familiar with this, what I'm about to say. On any given Sunday.
Right.
All right. All right. You know, team A could beat team B a million times. But if that one day they come out and they play better, they make a play, they get a call, something happens, somebody stubs a toe, gets the trip, gets blocked. Any given Preakness, that could change. There have been horses that missed the Derby that won the Preakness. So I tend to think that some of those stats get overrated and overanalyzed. I analyze each race differently. If I come up with a horse in the Derby that's coming from the UAE Derby, just because they never had a horse hit the board, I'm betting that horse anyway. Probably more so because I'll probably get a better price on it. If I like a new shooter in the Derby and a new shooter hasn't won in 20 years, I don't care. This could be the year that they do. You know what I mean? I look at it differently. Everybody goes left, I want to go right. You know, I say law of averages is a funny thing to understand. I'm not a mathematician, but I know the longer something doesn't happen, the better the odds get for it actually to happen when people think the opposite. People think, oh, you know what I'm saying? Like nobody wins 8 in a row, and the odds of that are like astronomical. But after you win 7, you know, the odds change. So that's kind of how I look at that.
Yeah, it doesn't affect your chances to win that last. After you've won 7, it doesn't affect the odds in the 8th race. That last question, John, as always, this has been great. I think brought on by all the turmoil on Derby week, we're hearing calls again to change the racing calendar and maybe spread the Triple Crown races out again. I don't think it's ever going to happen. We hear this from time to time. You know, if you wanted to do it, it might be a good time now because the Triple Crown has been hit. It's not like before we were helping to break. I guess at the time, who was the Triple Crown? Who was the last Triple Crown winner we were trying to? Was it? It was. I guess it had been affirmed. But now that's been, you know, it's justified. It's there's a couple of them in
American Pharaoh.
American Pharaoh. Yeah, we know we can do that. Do you think it's time to spread the races out, or do you like it the way it is?
You know, I happen to say something, and I very rarely opine on social media nowadays. I kind of save my opinions for Past the Wire and shows like this with people who I enjoy talking to, and you know, I feel if somebody's watching this, they actually care what I have to say on Twitter. Who knows what anybody, you know. So I was always a traditionalist and always against that, and always felt, well, it's not fair to the horses that did it under those other circumstances, and we know it can be done under those other circumstances. So why mess with it? And I had that stubborn traditionalist outlook on it. But now this year, for the first time, I'm starting to look at it more analytically and differently. And I'm starting to say different times, different era, different horses, everything's different game. Maybe it is time to adjust it and get more horses to compete, get more rivalries going. You know, back in the day, horses like Citation and some others ran prep races in between the Preakness and the Belmont. If a guy did that today, they'd probably have him arrested. You know what I mean, or maybe committed for a Baker Act evaluation. You know what I mean? So you know, maybe it's time to adjust and change with the times. I don't know. Maybe our thoroughbreds aren't as strong and durable as they were back then. So I'm definitely a lot more open and receptive to it. Um, if it goes that way, you know what I mean? You know, I'm still a traditionalist and I still like to maintain some of racing's traditions. But if it's better for the horse and it can be changed for the better of the game, so be it. You know what I mean? I would embrace it and it is what it is.
Yeah. Well, look, John, this is great. I always appreciate your time.
Always a
Listen.
pleasure.
Oh yeah, John. Listeners, go to Past the Wire TV on YouTube, YouTube channel, website as well. John also he's on Facebook. John does a tremendous job educating
Thank you.
players, interviewing the stars of the game, asking real questions. He's got some great interviews with some of my heroes, the writers of the game, the trainers. So lots to learn from John. Please turn into his social media. John, this has been great. Let's glad you're always willing to do this, and let's keep in closer touch.
Always a pleasure, Julian. Enjoy talking to you. Enjoy your opinion as well, and I think you do a great job with your show. Also, always a pleasure to be on.
Oh, appreciate it, John. All right, John. Have a good rest of your day, buddy.
You as well.
All right, take
Thank
care, buddy.